You spend your whole life building something, a dream, a family, a name, and then one day, you realize someone's been quietly taking the credit. My name's Margaret Turner, and for 30 years I poured every ounce of myself into our small-town bakery in Charleston, South Carolina. I baked before sunrise, handled every order, every recipe, every loyal customer who called me Miss Maggie. But when success came, the man I trusted most, my husband Calvin, put his name on everything. The logo, the contracts, even the bank account. I thought we were a team. Turns out I was just free labor under his smile. People say revenge is loud, but I learned something different. Sometimes the sweetest revenge is served quietly, right after you take back the keys to what's yours. When I look back now, it's almost funny how small it all started. Just me, Calvin, and a rented kitchen space that smelled like hope and burnt sugar. We were both past 60, and most folks our age were slowing down, settling into retirement or hobbies. But not us. We wanted something to call our own, something that carried both our names, Turner's Hearth Bakery. I used to wake up before sunrise, around 4:30, when the world was still quiet and soft. I'd roll out of bed, tie my apron, and let the oven heat up while Calvin brewed the first pot of coffee. I handled the baking, the recipes, the flavors. People couldn't find anywhere else. He handled the books, the deliveries, the ordering. It worked. For a while, we were like two halves of the same heartbeat. The town took to us faster than I expected. Our little shop on the corner of Main and Willow had once been a hardware store, and we turned it into a place that smelled of cinnamon, coffee, and butter. I'll never forget our first customer, Mrs. Gardner, the widow who lived 2 blocks over. She came in just as I pulled the first batch of scones from the oven. I handed her one still warm, and she said, "Feels like home in here, honey." That stuck with me. That's what I wanted the bakery to be, a bit of home for everyone who walked through the door. Calvin and I would stay late into the evenings those first months. Sometimes after closing, he'd pour us 2 glasses of sweet tea, and we'd sit by the window watching the streetlights flicker on. He'd say things like, "We really did it, Maggie. Can you believe it?" And I'd smile, tired but full, and answer, "We sure did, Cal, we sure did." There was something beautiful about those quiet nights, just us, the hum of the refrigerators, the scent of yeast and sugar lingering in the air. It felt like love had found new life in the rhythm of dough, rising and ovens humming. I handled every recipe myself. The pecan rolls were my mother's, passed down through generations. The honey cornbread muffins, those were my own creation. I made them for Calvin one morning when money was tight, and we couldn't afford much more than flour and butter. He loved them so much they became our bestseller. Folks came from neighboring towns just to get a dozen. Miss Maggie's muffins, they called them. I never corrected them when Calvin printed the menu with Turner's honey muffins. I told myself it didn't matter. We were a team. But small things began to shift, almost too quietly to notice. It started with him introducing himself differently to suppliers. "I'm Calvin Turner, owner of Turner's Hearth," he'd say, shaking hands with that firm grip of his. At first I brushed it off. Habit, I thought. Then I noticed how when local papers came around for stories on new businesses, he did most of the talking. We had this vision, he'd tell them, using we, but speaking only about himself. We worked hard for this, he'd say, but I realized his hands hadn't touched dough in months. Still, I let it go. I was tired of worrying about that credit. All I wanted was peace, to see our shop thrive, to make the kind of bread that made people close their eyes when they took the first bite. That, to me, was enough. The bakery grew faster than either of us expected. We started catering weddings, supplying cafes, even shipping baked goods out of state. I still did most of the baking myself. It kept me grounded. While Calvin was in meetings or taking phone calls, I was in the back, covered in flour, humming along to the radio, just like I'd always done. But with growth came change. Calvin started talking more about expansion, about profit margins and branding. I'd find invoices on the counter with numbers I didn't recognize, big ones. When I asked about them, he'd wave a hand and say, "Don't worry about it, Maggie, that's business stuff." I wanted to trust him. He was my husband. For over 35 years, we'd weathered everything together: debt, sickness, loss. I told myself that if he said it was fine, it probably was. I guess love makes you slow to question. One afternoon I was in the back decorating a birthday cake when a young woman came in looking for Calvin. She introduced herself as a business consultant. She spoke like she'd been here before. When she asked for Mr. Turner, the owner, something inside me went still. I wiped my hands on my apron and said, "He'll be right out." But that word echoed again. Owner. That night I mentioned it to Calvin. He smiled, said I shouldn't take things so seriously. "It's just easier that way," he told me. "People expect a man to handle that side of things." He said it like he was explaining the weather, something ordinary and unchangeable. I laughed it off too, even though it stung more than I wanted to admit. The next morning I woke up earlier than usual. I stood in our kitchen, looking out at the first light spilling over the magnolia trees, and I thought about all those mornings I'd spent making sure the bakery opened on time, making sure every loaf was perfect, every pastry made with care, and for a moment I wondered, if I stepped away, would anyone even notice? Calvin was out more often after that. He'd leave early, come home late, sometimes not say much at all. Meetings, he'd tell me, networking. I didn't ask. Maybe I didn't want to know. The bakery ran, customers were happy, and I told myself that was what mattered. One evening after closing, I was wiping down the counters when I noticed a stack of new business cards in a box by the register. They read, "Calvin Turner, founder and CEO, Turner's Hearth Bakery." No mention of me, not even small print. I sat there for a long time, staring at that card, the weight of it heavier than it should have been. I didn't cry, not then. I just tucked one of those cards into my apron pocket and went home. When Calvin came in later, smelling like cologne and bourbon, he kissed my forehead, said, "You're tired. You should rest more." I smiled and said, "You're probably right." But deep down I felt something settle, a quiet kind of disappointment that didn't shout, didn't fight. It just sat there. The following weekend, our town held its annual spring market. The bakery had a booth as always. I'd spent 2 days preparing pies, cookies, and those honey muffins folks couldn't get enough of. Calvin showed up just before the gates opened, dressed sharp, shaking hands with local business owners. I watched as he handed out those same new cards, laughing, charming everyone around. And when someone complimented the muffins, he said, "Our team's been working hard on perfecting that recipe." Our team. I remember standing there holding a tray of pastries and feeling something change in me. It wasn't anger, not yet. It was more like a slow, steady recognition, a truth I'd been avoiding for too long. Later that night, after everyone had gone home, I locked up the booth alone. The street was empty except for a few lampposts flickering in the distance. I leaned against the van, listening to the faint hum of the town around me. For the first time I said it out loud, "He doesn't see me anymore." It wasn't self-pity, it was realization. I had built something with love, and somewhere along the way, he'd started treating that love like a resource to manage. Still, when I went home, I cooked dinner, set 2 plates, waited for him to come through the door. When he did, I smiled and asked how the event went. He talked about how great the turnout was, how people really see us as a brand now. I nodded, listening. Inside, something was shifting, a seed of quiet awareness taking root. I didn't say anything that night, but I remember washing dishes and thinking about Mrs. Gardner's words years ago. "Feels like home in here, honey." The bakery used to feel like home too. But now it felt like a showroom, like a place that wore my soul but carried someone else's name. And though I didn't know it yet, that was the night something inside me began to wake up again. Because sometimes the worst kind of betrayal doesn't happen all at once. It comes slowly, through small changes, quiet omissions, and the sound of your name being replaced by someone else's. And before I even realized it, the dream I built with my hands was slipping through my fingers, one signature, one handshake, one business card at a time. But not for long, because as the bakery grew, so did his ego, and as his pride rose, so did my silence, and my resolve to take it all back. It started with the little things, the kind of changes you tell yourself not to notice because you're tired, or busy, or just too trusting. Calvin began handling more of the business side, as he liked to call it. He said it with a kind of casual authority, like it was natural. "You don't need to worry about these forms, Maggie," he'd say, waving a hand over a stack of papers. "It's all boring tax stuff." He'd give me that easy smile of his, the one that used to calm me, and I'd nod, letting him handle it, because that's what you do when you've spent decades with someone. You trust. I was the baker, after all, the one covered in flour before dawn, pulling trays from the oven while the rest of the town still slept. I loved the work itself more than the business around it. The smell of butter browning, the soft crackle of crust as bread cooled. That was my language. Numbers and ledgers? Those were his. Or so I thought. As months went by, I noticed more people started calling Calvin directly. The flower supplier, the new coffee distributor, even the man who handled our equipment repairs. One afternoon I picked up the phone at the shop, just have it, and the voice on the other end asked, "Oh, is this Mr. Turner's assistant?" I froze. It wasn't said with malice. The man probably didn't think twice about it. But to me, that one word, assistant, landed like a blow to the chest. I remember standing there in the quiet of the bakery, the phone warm against my ear, my heart thudding in disbelief. When I hung up, I stood there for a long while, wiping the counter just to have something to do with my hands. I tried to brush it off, telling myself titles didn't matter. But deep down, something inside me cracked. I'd built this place, we had, sure, but I knew every corner of that kitchen like it was part of my own home. And yet, somehow, I'd become invisible in it. That night, I brought it up to Calvin while we were locking up. I said, "Someone called me your assistant today." I laughed lightly, trying to make it sound casual, but I was watching his face. He didn't even flinch, just chuckled and said, "People get things mixed up, Nike. Don't take it to heart." Then, he reached over, patted my shoulder, and walked out to the car. But that word didn't leave me. It sat in my chest like something sharp that wouldn't dissolve. Over the next few weeks, I started noticing how much of the bakery's paperwork I'd stopped seeing. Bills, invoices, even the rent receipts. They all seemed to go straight to his office now. When I asked about them, he'd shrug and say, "Just try to keep things organized. You've got enough on your plate." Maybe that's what stung most. It sounded like care, like he was helping me. But there was something else too, a tone, a kind of gentleness. That wasn't kindness. It was control, disguised as love. I tried to convince myself I was imagining it. I told myself that marriage, especially at our age, meant balance, compromise. Maybe he was just better at business, and I needed to let him lead that part. But then came the day he hired someone without even telling me. A young woman named Janelle, fresh out of college, polite and quiet. She was nice enough, and she worked the counter a few days a week. But what caught my attention was how she talked to Calvin. "Yes, sir, I'll file that, Mr. Turner. I'll bring those invoices to your desk." His desk. I didn't even realize he'd moved one into the office. The old space we'd used for storing flour and extra boxes was suddenly cleared out, repainted, and set up with a computer, a filing cabinet, and a shiny brass nameplate that read, "Calvin Turner, Founder." I remember standing in the doorway that first day, my apron dusted white, staring at that nameplate. Calvin turned in his chair and smiled like nothing was wrong. "Just trying to make things more official," he said. "The new accountant said we should have some proper structure." Structure," I repeated softly, like I was testing the word. He nodded. "We're a real company now, Maggie, not just a mom and pop anymore." Know why, but something in me recoiled when he said that. Not just a mom and pop, like what we built. The early mornings, the sleepless nights, the two of us kneading dough and dreaming together wasn't enough anymore. It was strange how quickly warmth can turn cold. He still kissed my cheek when he came home, still poured my coffee in the mornings. But there was a distance, a quiet change in the air that I couldn't unfeel. Then one evening I found an envelope on the counter, addressed to Mr. Calvin Turner, owner. It was a business license renewal. I don't know why I opened it, maybe instinct. Inside, it listed him as the sole proprietor of Turner's Hearth Bakery. Not us, not co-owners, just him. I read that letter 3 times before I sat down. My hands were trembling, but not out of anger, out of realization. It wasn't one mistake. It was a pattern, a slow, deliberate shifting of everything we'd built together, one signature at a time. When he came home that night, I didn't say anything. I cooked dinner like always, pot roast and mashed potatoes, his favorite. We ate in mere silence, the sound of the TV humming low in the background. I remember thinking, how do you confront someone who's smiling at you while taking your name off the door? Later, after he went to bed, I sat at the kitchen table and looked through our filing drawer. There were gaps, papers missing. The original partnership agreement we'd signed years ago wasn't there. The old lease for the building, on too. I stayed up till nearly 3 a.m, digging through drawers, cabinets, and old boxes. And the more I searched, the more I realized I didn't even know what was mine anymore. It's strange how betrayal doesn't always arrive with shouting or slammed doors. Sometimes it comes in the quiet turning of a key, The subtle way someone shifts the narrative until your name fades from the story entirely. A few days later, I tried to talk to him again. I waited until after dinner and said, "Calvin, I was looking at some of the paperwork and I noticed my name isn't on the new business license." He didn't even look up from his plate, just said, "Oh, that's just formality. It's easier that way for taxes." But that, he cut me off, his tone sharp for the first time. "Maggie, you worry too much. Let me handle the business. You stick to the baking. It's what you're good at." The words hit me harder than I let on. I swallowed the lump in my throat, nodded, and finished my dinner in silence. That night I lay in bed listening to him snore beside me. The ceiling fan hummed overhead, and I stared up at the dark, realizing for the first time in our marriage I didn't feel safe, not because he was dangerous, but because I no longer knew who he was. Days turned into weeks, and his control tightened. He started handling the payroll, saying it kept things simple. The new delivery van was purchased in his name. Even the bakery's utilities were rerouted to his personal account. It was so subtle, so calculated, that to anyone else it might have looked like good management. But I knew better, and yet I stayed quiet. Maybe out of fear, maybe out of love, or maybe out of that deep aching hope that the person you built a life with couldn't possibly be building a world without you in it. Then came the morning that broke the illusion completely. I was in the kitchen, checking inventory when the flour supplier dropped by. A new guy this time, friendly, talkative. He smiled and said, "Mr. Turner's really got a great setup here. You must be lucky to work for him." I remember the sound that escaped me wasn't quite a laugh, but not a sob either. Something in between. I managed to say, "Yes, lucky." When he left, I locked the front door, sat on the counter, and stared out the window. Outside, the town was waking up. Walking by with coffee cups and children in tow, I'd baked for these people for years, fed them, celebrated with them. But none of them knew that. On paper, I didn't even exist in the very place I'd created. I felt hollow, like a ghost haunting my own life. That evening, after closing, I went through the office again. I opened the filing cabinet, one drawer at a time, reading every label. Contracts, tax forms, new lease agreements, all with his signature alone. Mine was gone, erased. I sat back in the chair, my hands cold, and whispered to myself, "He took it." Not in anger, just realization. I didn't confront him that night, not yet. Instead, I went home, poured myself a cup of tea, and opened my old recipe book, the one with grease stains and torn pages, the one I'd written by hand all those years ago. And as I flipped through those pages, it hit me. Everything that mattered, the heart, the soul, the flavor, was still mine. He might have taken the papers, but not the craft, not the name people whispered when they said, "Miss Maggie's Muffins." Still, that didn't change what he'd done, and in that quiet, I decided I wasn't going to let him keep taking, because if the law said he owned the bakery, I needed to find a way to remind the world who built it. And maybe, just maybe, find out what else he'd been hiding. The envelope fell heavier than the paper it held. I remember the weight in my hands like I remember the weight of a well-used mixing bowl. Familiar, inevitable. I hadn't expected to find those registration documents where I did, tucked under a stack of supplier invoices in the little office he'd set up last month. I was looking for an old receipt, something ordinary, when the edge of white paper caught my eye. I eased it out like you ease a loaf from a pan, careful not to tear the crust. My name wasn't on it. Calvin's signature was there, bold and neat, the kind of signature people use when they want to make sure you don't look twice. The paperwork read like cold facts. New registration, updated ownership, sole proprietor listed as Calvin Turner. I sat down on the office chair, the vinyl squeaking beneath me. The room smelled faintly of coffee and the lemon cleaner he liked. For a moment the hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen sounded far away, like it belonged to someone else's life. You learn a lot about yourself in that kind of silence. I replayed the morning routines in my head, the oven warming, while the street was still dreaming, the rhythm of kneading that steadied me through hard days, the way customers came in wiping their hands on their coats and left with a little more pleasure than they had walked in with. Those things were mine. They had always been mine, but the paper was the law, and it said otherwise. I carried the documents to him because I couldn't live in my kitchen with that paper haunting countertops. He was in the shop office, the new desk lamp painting his face in a practical glow. He looked up when I came in, as if surprised, and smiled the way men smile when they think the world is the shape they left it in. He took them from me, thumbed through the pages like a man skimming a menu. Then he folded his fingers and leaned back as if settling into a comfortable chair. "Calvin," I said, keeping my voice even, "because Andrew does strange things to people. It makes them loud when you don't want noise. This says you're the sole owner." He didn't blink. There was a slow, almost bored lift at the corner of his mouth. "Yes, Maggie," he said. "We did that last month. It's better for taxes." His voice had that easy rhythm, the one that used to make me feel safe. "You wouldn't know what to do with the business side anyway." He said it like a fact, not a cruelty, as if economics were a foreign language I'd politely never bothered to learn. The sentence hit somewhere beneath my ribs, not because of the words themselves, I knew the sting of being underestimated, but because of the way he said it, like it was the truth he'd been waiting to announce. For a moment the room was full of the small noises of the bakery, the tick of the clock, the distant clatter of a spoon, the soft murmur of a radio behind the counter. I felt absurdly like I was listening to the soundtrack of a life we'd shared while being told I wasn't allowed to dance to it anymore. I could have argued, I could have taken the papers, set them down on the counter, and raised my voice until the neighbors came to see what was happening. I could have shoved the reality back into his face and made him name every step he'd taken. But shouting never suited me. Shouting has a way of making people retreat into their versions of the story. I wanted no retreat. I wanted him to see me as I was, not as someone he could misplace with a neat signature. So I nodded. It's a simple action, a small concession. But that night it felt like a decision in itself. I folded my hands in my apron and squeezed them there, feeling the paper's edge between my fingers like a splinter I couldn't quite get out. I said nothing more, and in that silence there was a kind of acknowledging that I would remember every detail. He kissed my forehead that evening, like he always did, a quick press of lips that was more habit than ceremony. He told me to rest, and that he'd take care of everything. I went to bed and listened to the house breathe, a sound I had known for years, and yet it had shifted tone somehow, like a familiar song played in a minor key. Sleep didn't come easy. When it did, it felt thin, as if someone had peeled off the heavy blanket of certainty I'd taken for granted. Morning came with a small, deliberate calm. I was up before him, not because I had to be, but because the plan inside me had begun forming like dough left to rise. People think plans have to be loud to be effective. They don't. I learned then that plans are often quiet, like tending a low flame, so it won't go out. You check the oven, you weigh the flour twice, you make small, steady motions, until an edifice is built from patient repetition. I started with the things I could touch. I went through the filing drawer where we kept receipts and old contracts, the trusty place that smelled like paper and flour. I methodically copied invoices, took photographs of old lease agreements, and made lists of accounts and contacts. Each page I duplicated felt like reclaiming a small corner of the life he'd tried to make disappear. I wrapped the copies carefully and slipped them into a small box I kept under the counter, behind a row of aprons. No one would think to look there. While I worked, my hands remembered the rhythms of the shop, folding dough, smoothing batter, scoring loaves. The work steadied me the way prayer steadies some people. It was almost meditative, this act of preparing and protecting. I also made a mental list of people who knew us before the shine of the new signage. Mrs. Gardner with her worn hands, Mr. Hightower, who'd been our first investor, and who still owned a little slice of pride and old-world stubbornness. The accountant who'd laughed the first time we spoke about opening a bakery at our age, and who had then, somehow, become someone I needed on my side. There was craft to gathering truth. Documents are not just paper, they are time capsules of decisions and signatures, small testimonies of who was present at pivotal moments. That afternoon I called a few people, old friends, not loud advocates, but people whose voices carried weight in town when they spoke. I asked questions in the gentle, roundabout way I always use when I don't want to startle. "Do you remember when we signed the first lease?" I'd say, allowing them to place themselves in the picture. Most remembered, most liked the bakery for the same reasons I did. Some were surprised at the way the ownership had shifted. Surprise is a useful thing. It wakes people up. I also learned to pay attention to details Calvin assumed I wouldn't notice. When he signed papers, his handwriting slanted in a certain way, quick and efficient. His handwriting made his choices feel irrevocable. I wondered briefly and irrationally when the last time was that he'd looked at me with the same curiosity as when we first met. But I didn't linger in the question. Curiosity then became currency. I invested it in observing rather than pleading. On the third day, with the box under the counter and a list of names in my pocket, I hired a young woman to help at the bakery. Her name was Rosa, and she came with fresh sleeves rolled up and a steady pair of hands. I didn't tell her why I was hiring her beyond needing help for the Saturdays. What I wanted was someone who could be my eyes and ears during hours when I wasn't always in the back. You don't have to tell everyone your plans. Some people are simply companions in your work, and that's enough. Rosa did more than scoop flour and plate scones. She learned to hand me a filing when I asked, to say, "Oh, Mr. Turner called," without implying anything. Her presence was small insurance. The point of a quiet plan is you don't make room for drama. You make room for the truth to grow until it is strong enough to stand on its own. That week I began to talk to our suppliers in a different tone. I asked for copies of the contracts I'd signed in the early days. Some hesitated, embarrassed. They'd always assumed Calvin handled that side of things, and perhaps he had for a spell, but most had records. Most had paper. Paper is an honest thing. It doesn't take sides. It simply exists. There were moments in those days when grief and fury tangled in me like knotted twine. He had taken my name, turned our story toward his signature, and left me to wonder how easily a life can be rerouted by a few clever strokes of a pen. But the anger did not have to be big to matter. I let it make quiet fuel in me. I used it to get up earlier, to make more careful copies, to call the right people at the right time. It felt less like vengeance than like recalibration. I wanted what was rightfully mine, yes, but I also wanted to preserve the kindness of the life we'd led together. I wanted the bakery to be honest again. On a Friday afternoon, while the light slanted through the front windows and dust motes waltzed in the beeves, I made a list of small actions I could take that would not scream but would shift things. Request official copies from the county clerk, schedule a sit-down with the accountant, who'd known our books before the shine. Quietly, verify the lease records at the property office. Step by step, I wrote them down and checked them off as I completed them. There was a calm satisfaction in ticking a box on a list. It felt like laying down a foundation, each task a stone. I did not tell Calvin. He continued to go about his business, charming vendors, and signing glossy cards with his name on them. He seemed to enjoy the role he'd adopted, and that, I decided, would be his undoing. When someone believes a story long enough, they stop checking the facts. When someone assumes ownership because they call it by their name, they forget how fragile the architecture is beneath the surface. I kept baking. Each morning the shop filled with the warm smell of caramelizing sugar and yeast, and people kept coming in with the same gentle routines. They did not know, most of them, the quiet work happening behind the scenes. They only knew they liked the way their bread softened in their mouths, the way our scones warmed their hands on a cold morning. I let the ordinary love of my craft be my armor. It kept me steady, and when night came, after I'd locked the door and tucked the copies away in their safe place, I would sit at the small kitchen table, sip tea, and feel the growing shape of a plan that had been forged, not in anger, but in the clear light of truth. I would think about what I needed to say when the time came. Not accusations, but evidence. Not screaming, but holding up the papers and allowing the town and the law to see what had been. I still remember, with that peculiar clarity that lives in all old stories, the exact stillness of one morning when I woke before dawn and turned the key to the bakery. The street was empty, the sky a thin ribbon of gray, and I was hunched over my ledger like it was the only map I had left. I felt both small and enormous at once. Small because I had been overlooked, enormous because I now knew the truth and had begun to gather it together. Because if he thought I was powerless, he was about to learn who had always laid the foundation. When I first started gathering papers, it felt more like tidying than anything revolutionary. Old receipts, faded invoices, the little notes I'd stuffed into the recipe book, things you keep because they remind you of a life well made. I'd sit at the small table in the back room with the lamp on low, the hum of the bakery, a soft companion, and I would sort. I would stack. I would make copies. It was a ritual as much as it was work, my hands moving through the past, steadying it into something that could be shown plainly to anyone who needed proof. The copying itself was humble. I borrowed the church's scanner on a weekday, when no one else was using it. Sister June, who runs the thrift shop, knows everyone's business and expects nothing less than the best manners from you. She handed me the keys and said, "Bring it back before sundown, Maggie." I lugged the scanner home like a small, urgent treasure chest and set it up on our kitchen counter. The thing buzzed and whirred in a way that felt important. I fed it documents while the kettle came to a boil, and the day began to wake outside the window. There were old invoices from the earliest days, when we used to get flour from the supplier in the next town over, and split a dozen cinnamon rolls as payment for a late delivery. There were emails printed on cheap paper, contracts with margins folded like little flags marking moments when hands met and agreements were made. Each sheet I copied felt like another stitch in the seams of the truth. I made neat piles, founding papers, early investors' agreements, lease documents, old checks with faded endorsements. I numbered them, wrote notes in the margin, and slid them into a box I'd designated for safekeeping. It lived under the counter, wrapped in an old towel, behind a row of aprons. That was the sort of hiding place you find when you want a secret to be both safe and very ordinary. When the box was full, I sat back and let out a breath like someone who has finished a long row of stitches. The work of copying gave me a quiet power. It was practical and clear, the kind of power that doesn't need to shout. I kept thinking of Linda's hands, my mother's hands, and how she used to say, "Paper doesn't lie, Maggie, it just waits." I'd never liked legal talk much. It always sounded hard and cold. But that night it felt like a warm room where I could lay out everything and say, simply, this is how it was. The next step for me was people. I knew documents were important, but the town is a living thing. Memories live there in the bag tellers' heads, and the grocery clerks' minds, and the stories folks tell on porches. People remember things the way paper sometimes does not. I started making calls. Soft ones, the kind that sound casual but are precise underneath. Mr. Hightower answered on the second ring. He's a retired mill worker with a handshake like oak and a memory like a ledger. He and his wife had put a little money into our bakery when we first mentioned the idea over coffee and a half-baked biscuit. Back then, that kindness felt like the kind of fuel only a small town to give, faith without a bank balance to back it. When I said hello, he chuckled like he always does and invited me over for pie. Sitting at his small kitchen table, the afternoon light through the window made the crumbs on my plate look like stars. We talked about old times, the first time I burned a batch because I forgot to turn off the timer, the time Calvin ran out of yeast before an early morning rush, and came back with flour on his shoes and a grin. Mr. Hightower's face grew soft when I asked about the early paperwork. "I remember signing something at the diner," he said, tapping the table thoughtfully. "You remember how you looked, nervous but dead set on that oven." He laughed, and I felt a warmth that had nothing to do with sugar. That's when I asked the question I'd been turning over gentle and careful. "Do you remember who was listed on the original lease?" He squinted and said, "I might. Let me check my ledger." He went to his shed, shuffled, and came back with a thin notebook. He flipped the pages like he was reading the town's history in shorthand. When he found the entry, he looked up slowly. "Margaret Turner," he said plainly. He had written it the way men of a certain age write things, clear without flourish. "You signed it the day you and Cal celebrated with coffee." He spoke as if he'd been there the whole time, which in a way he had been. I thanked him and felt that small knot of relief ease. The lease in my name, it was a small thing and a huge thing at once. I felt the presence of the paper like a hand on my shoulder. If the lease was indeed in my name, then the foundation of our bakery, the roof, the floor, the right to be there, had always borne my name in ink. Had he assumed too much? Had I assumed too little? Those were the quiet questions that kept me awake some nights. But now there was something tangible to hold on to. With Mr. Hightower's memory confirmed, I visited the county clerk the next day. Their office smelled of lemon and old stamps, and the woman behind the window recognized me by name. She pulled the file with a practiced motion, slid it across, and there it was, the lease, stamped and dated, with my name written in the margin in a neat, confident hand. I sat at the small table in their waiting area, and breathed like someone who'd been running in a headwind, and finally could walk for a while. When I took the copy home, I felt oddly like a gardener bringing a seed back to the soil. It was proof, yes, but it was also the seed of something more, of a plan that needed patience to flower. I copied the lease carefully, tucked the original copies in their safe place, and made sure to have backups in 2 different places. This was the sort of low-level thoroughness that seems dull until the moment it prevents a collapse. I reached out to the accountant who'd known our books before Calvin's new desk had the brass nameplate on it. Our name was Alma. A sensible woman who speaks plainly and keeps a fierce line of loyalty to whoever's honest with her. When I told her I wanted to review records, she didn't hesitate. "Meet me at the coffee shop," she said. Over chipped mugs, we went through statements, bank deposits, payments, payroll. Alma's eyes, trained to spot a number out of place, went narrow when she saw a series of transfers. "He's been funneling some funds through accounts that don't match our usual vendors," she said quietly. "That's not illegal necessarily, but it's odd." Her words were measured, but there was a firmness underneath that felt like a promise. She would help me read the ledger until the lines made sense. Together with Alma and Mr. Hightower's quiet confirmation, it started to feel like something more than just me clutching a brittle paper. It felt like the town had a memory I could call on, and the law had a form that respected truth. I didn't relish the idea of property fights or public drama. That's not how I do things. The people in this town are my family. I wanted the truth to be restored like you restore a faded quilt, carefully patch by patch. The discovery of the lease in my name changed the game in a still small way. It didn't fix what had been done, but it gave me leverage the way a good recipe gives you leverage over an oven, control and confidence. I began to map out what I needed to do, confirm every contract, gather witnesses who remembered the founding, get the accountant, prepare a clean summary of the finances. It was work that demanded patience and attention to detail, the kind of work that, frankly, suits bakers well. We are used to long hours and precise measures. We understand that flavor is a thing that requires time. There were moments I almost let impatience in. Calvin kept smiling, kept handing out cards with his name, kept playing at being the public face while skipping the backroom work. He tossed a few small dismissive comments my way, about my worrying too much, about leaving the business stuff to him, like a man tossing a towel over a draft. The towel does not stop the draft long term. The draft eventually makes itself known. So I waited. Waiting is not idleness, it is readiness. I polished my copies, filed them where they could be reached quickly, and set my mind to the calendar. Timing would be everything. There is a particular moment in the life of a small business, when the lease comes up for renewal, when signatures, dates, and legal names all matter again. It is the moment when the building itself asks, "Who belongs here?" I marked that day carefully on my calendar and kept it like a small secret. In the days that followed, I kept working the shop with the same care as always. I kneaded dough before dawn. I iced cakes in the same slow, patient motions. Customers continued to come and tell me the same things, how my bread reminded them of their grandmothers, how the scone was just right with a cup of coffee. Those compliments were steady anchors. They reminded me that while papers and names fight for recognition in offices, the true meaning of a bakery is in the hands that make it and the mouths that enjoy it. At night, when the lights were low and the town slept, I would sit at the small kitchen table and go over the lists again, checking names, dates, places. I made notes on Post-its and tucked them into the pages of the ledger. I practiced the calm voice I would use when I finally needed to speak, not loud, not accusing, simply holding the proof up and letting it do the heavy lifting. The best kind of confrontation, I decided, is the one where truth does the talking. So I waited quietly until the day he needs me most, until the lease renewal comes due and the question of ownership will be, in black and white, impossible to ignore. The morning it happened was just like any other. Cold air slipping through the narrow alley behind a bakery, the smell of yeast and cinnamon already rising from the oven. The sun was barely up and the street still carried that blue-gray quiet of a small town before it starts humming. I'd been awake since 4, same as always, but that morning felt different, not rushed, not routine, just right. Like something that had been wrong for too long had finally tilted back into place. I stood by the counter, tying my apron. The shop light glowed warm through the front windows, and for the first time in a long while my hands didn't tremble. The sign above the door was new. I'd spent the night before watching the young man I'd hired finish drilling it into place. Fresh white letters on a wooden board that read, "Turner's Hearth Bakery, founded by Margaret Turner." It was simple, honest, the way things were meant to be. When I saw it lit up that morning, I didn't feel proud so much as peaceful, like a long argument had finally ended in silence. The good kind, not the cold kind. The first customer came in just after 6, as usual. Mrs. Gardner, who still remembers when the shop smelled like paint and plaster during our first month. She looked at the new sign, then back at me, and smiled without a word. Just that little nod women give each other when words aren't needed. "Morning, Maggie," she said, setting her purse on the counter. "You make the cinnamon rolls today. Every single one, I said, smiling, just like always. We both knew what that meant. By 7 the shop was humming. The coffee machine hissed, the bell above the door jingled, and people filled the seats, laughing softly, reading newspapers, eating the kind of breakfast that comes with comfort baked in. I moved through the space like a musician returning to her instrument. Every motion felt true again. Wiping the counter, slicing bread, pouring coffee. My name was back where it belonged, and even the air seemed lighter for it. And then through the glass I saw him. Calvin. He was earlier than usual. I watched from behind the counter as he came up the sidewalk, his coat pulled tight, his keys in hand. He looked tired, the kind of tired that doesn't come from work, but from worry. His steps slowed when he reached the door. I saw the moment he noticed the new lock, the small flicker of confusion that passed across his face. He tried the key once, it didn't turn. He tried again. Still nothing. I stayed where I was, polishing a mug, watching through the reflection in the glass. He jiggled the handle a third time, then stepped back, his eyes moving upward. That's when he saw the sign. It was quiet, but I could almost feel the silence in his chest. His shoulders stiffened, and for a moment he just stood there, staring at the name that had been his and mine, now standing firmly on its own. Founded by Margaret Turner. He opened the door a moment later. I left it unlocked for the morning rush. The bell chimed like it always did, but the air shifted when he stepped inside. "Maggie," he said, his voice sharp with disbelief. "What is this?" His tone wasn't loud, not yet. Just clipped. Controlled, like a man used to being in charge and not understanding how he'd lost the script. I turned to him calmly, hands still on the counter. "Good morning, Calvin." He looked around at the customers, at the sign above the counter, at the staff behind me who suddenly found reasons to look busy. "You changed the locks?" "I did." "And the sign?" "Yes," I said. "The sign, too." He blinked, confusion flashing into something closer to anger. "You can't just—" "I can," I said softly, cutting him off without raising my voice. I reached under the counter, pulled out a small manila envelope, and slid it across to him. "You might want to read these." He hesitated before opening it. Inside were 2 papers, copies of the lease and the original ownership registration. I'd made sure they were crisp, clear, and official. My name was written plainly at the bottom of each, ink that hadn't faded in all these years. He read them once, then again, his lips pressed into a thin line. "I don't understand," he muttered, but it wasn't confusion anymore. It was disbelief, the kind that turns a man's voice small. "The paperwork, I handled all of that." I nodded. "You handled a lot of things, Calvin, but you never looked closely at this one." He turned another page, and when his eyes hit the line that said, "Leaseholder, Margaret Turner," his breath caught. For a moment, the bakery fell into that still hush that only truth can bring. Even the hum of the refrigerator seemed quieter. I didn't smile. I didn't gloat. I just stood there, apron dusted in flour, my hands resting on the counter the way they had for years. "You can take the money," I said gently, my voice steady. "You can take the accounts, the balance sheets, even the van if you want. But you don't get to take my name." His eyes lifted to mine, and for a second, I saw something in them I hadn't seen in a long time. Not pride, not anger. Just realization. The quiet, heavy kind that makes a man see himself clearly for the first time. He didn't speak right away. Maybe there was nothing left to say. Behind him I saw Mrs. Gardner watching from her table, her hands folded around her coffee cup. A few other regulars pretended not to listen, but everyone felt the weight of that moment, the way history was being rewritten, softly, but completely, right there in a room that smelled of cinnamon and fresh bread. Calvin set the papers down slowly. "You went behind my back. I went where you left me," I said simply. "I just found my way home." He looked around again, as if trying to find a corner of the bakery that still belonged to him. The shelves were lined with the recipes I'd written by hand, the same ones he'd once called too sentimental to standardize. The walls still held photos from our first years, the ones I'd refused to take down even after things soured. Every piece of this place was proof of a life built, not claimed. He took a deep breath, the kind that carries surrender inside it. "You had this planned. I had this protected," I corrected, "long before you decided my work didn't count." For a moment I thought he might argue. But then his shoulders fell, his eyes dimmed, and whatever fight he had left went out like a candle in the wind. He looked around one last time, then nodded, more to himself than to me. "Guess there's nothing left to say," he murmured. "No," I said softly. "Not today." He stood there a few seconds longer. then turned and walked to the door. As he left, the bell above it chimed again, that same gentle sound that had always marked the start of another morning. But this time, it felt like an ending. When the door closed behind him, the room stayed quiet for a beat. Then someone cleared their throat, and life began again. Coffee poured, laughter returned, the scent of pastries rose in the air. I exhaled slowly. One of the customers, a young woman who'd started coming in after we reopened the pastry counter, smiled at me from across the room. "You okay, Mrs. Turner?" she asked softly. I nodded. Better than I'd been in years. And I meant it. As the morning went on, I went back to doing what I've always done best: kneading, baking, serving. But inside, something had shifted. The weight I'd been carrying, of betrayal, of invisibility, of being reduced to someone's assistant in my own life, was gone. What replaced it wasn't pride or revenge. It was something quieter: peace. Later that afternoon, after the last rush died down, I stepped outside and looked up at the new sign again. The letters gleamed softly in the sunlight, founded by Margaret Turner. For the first time, that name didn't feel like a formality. It felt like a promise, a truth reclaimed. I thought about Calvin then, where he might be, what he might be feeling. I didn't hate him. I didn't even wish him harm. What I felt was more like forgiveness, but the kind that doesn't excuse. The kind that simply says, "You no longer get to define me." I realized then that this was never just about a bakery. It was about everything that name represented. The hours I spent making something beautiful with my own hands, the faith I poured into it, the part of me that had always been there, quietly holding it all together. Calvin might have walked away humiliated, but I wasn't gloating. I didn't need to. Because I hadn't just reclaimed a business. I'd reclaimed myself. And as I stood there, apron dusted in flour, hands smelling faintly of vanilla and dough, I finally understood what real ownership meant. It wasn't about papers or signatures. It was about presence, persistence, and the quiet, unshakable knowing of who you are and what yours, and no matter who tries to erase it. It's funny how quiet a bakery can be before sunrise. Even now, all these months later, I still find myself standing by the window before the light comes up, apron tied, hair pinned back, coffee cooling on the counter beside me. The ovens hum softly in the background, the same way they always have. The rhythm of it never changes. It's the sound of beginning again. The shop is smaller now, just me, a part-time girl from the high school, and a few tables by the window. I let go of the second location Calvin once pushed for, and the catering contracts I never really wanted. What's left is simpler, more human. I can feel the heartbeat of the place again, the laughter when the first customers come in, the clinking of coffee cups, the stories exchanged over pastries still warm from the oven. People still tell me it feels like the old days again. And I smile every time because I know what they mean. The shelves are humbler now, the pastries fewer, but everything in this little space feels alive again. Honest, unforced. I don't rush anymore. I don't glance at the clock the way I used to when we were trying to impress suppliers or investors. These days, I measure time differently. The rise of dough, the smell of cinnamon, the laughter of familiar voices drifting through the doorway. There's something beautiful in earning back a quiet life. Sometimes when the morning light hits just right, the dust in the air looks like sugar, floating slow and golden through the beams that pour across the counter. I stand there, hands dusted with flour, and I think about all the years I spent giving away pieces of myself, one compromise at a time. It didn't happen all at once. It never does. You think you're sharing the load, but somewhere along the way, you stop being seen for what you built. You just become part of the background of someone else's success story. That's what this place had become. And that's what I took back. I didn't take it back to prove anything. I didn't do it to humiliate him or to win. I did it because I wanted to remember who I was, before all the paperwork and the power plays, and the names printed on letterhead. I did it because love, the real kind, doesn't erase you. It includes you. And somewhere along the way, I'd forgotten that truth. The first few weeks after Calvin left were strange. I expected anger, but it didn't come. What came instead was quiet, the kind that settles in after a storm, not empty, not hollow, just still. I filled the silence with music in the mornings, old country songs on a low radio. Customers came and went, some asking gently where he was, others avoiding the subject altogether. I just told them, "It's just me now," and that was enough. Over time, people started to notice the changes. Not the sign, not the menu. Those had been small. It was the feeling they noticed, the way the shop felt like home again. They said the bread tasted the way it used to. The air smelled sweeter, the coffee poured slower. Truth is, it wasn't the recipes that changed. It was me. There's a kind of peace that comes from doing work with your own two hands, not for credit, not for applause, but simply because it's yours, because it means something. On Sundays, when the shop's closed, I sit by the back door with a cup of tea and look out at the alley where it all began. I still remember that first year, Calvin and I painting the walls by hand, laughing when the sign went crooked. I remember his good days too, the kind where he'd hum old songs while kneading dough beside me, or brag about my cakes to customers. Those memories don't hurt anymore. They just sit quietly in the back of my mind like old friends I outgrew, but never stopped wishing well. I suppose that's forgiveness in its simplest form. Every now and then, someone will mention him, say they saw him at the hardware store, or heard he moved 2 towns over. I don't ask for details. I just nod and keep kneading. Whatever lesson he needed, life will hand it to him in its own time. My part in his story is done. One morning, late spring, I was opening up when a little boy tugged on my sleeve. His mother buys muffins here every Saturday. He pointed at the new sign and asked, "Are you the Turner from the Turner's Bakery?" I smiled. "Yes, honey, I'm the Turner." He grinned, satisfied, and ran off to pick out a cookie. And in that tiny moment, I felt something settle inside me, the kind of peace you can't buy or win, only earn. That's when it hit me. I hadn't just taken back the bakery. I'd taken back my name, and with it, my voice, my worth, my story. There are days now when I catch myself humming as I work, the same tune I used to hum when the bakery was brand new, and we didn't know if anyone would even come. I'll look out the window, see the sunrise breaking through the clouds, and realize that life, much like dough, always rises again. You just have to give it time, patience, and a little bit of warmth. Sometimes customers linger after their coffee, chatting about the town or their children, and I listen. I don't rush them. I let the day unfold the way bread rises naturally, without force. I've learned that not every kind of success shines under bright lights. Some of it glows quietly in the corner of a small bakery, where one woman finally stands tall in her own name again. One afternoon I found an old photograph tucked in one of the recipe books. It was from the early days, Calvin and me, both younger, both smiling, both covered in flour. I studied it for a long time. Then I slid it into a frame and set it on the back counter, near the cash register. Not as a reminder of what went wrong, but of what I survived. Because every part of that story, even the painful ones, led me back here. Now every morning when I unlock the door, I use the same keys I once handed over in trust. They fit perfectly, the metal warm from my palm, the sound familiar and satisfying. I flip the sign to open, and the bell rings the way it always has. And I think quietly about how full circle life can be when you stop running from it and start standing in it again. I've learned that sometimes justice doesn't need a courtroom. It doesn't need to shout or punish or destroy. Sometimes justice is a woman with flour on her hands, unlocking a door to a shop she built with love, and finally walking into it without fear. It's peace served warm, one loaf at a time. I didn't take revenge to win. I took it to remember who I was, and I think that's what real justice feels like. Not loud, not cruel, just steady. Just right. The camera lingers on her unlocking the shop at dawn, the same keys she once handed over in trust. The light spills across her face, the sound of morning beginning again. A quiet smile crosses her lips. Sometimes justice doesn't need a courtroom, just a steady hand, and the courage to take back what you made with love. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to leave a like, share it with someone who believes in quiet strength, and subscribe to Quiet Justice for more stories of courage, resilience, and truth. Because sometimes the sweetest justice is simply getting your name back.